The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation projects in 2 years' time, Lake Mead may be set to be at its shallowest levels in recorded history.
The precious commodity on the desert, but the water level in Lake Mead is down, and without action, the entire valley could someday face some serious shortage.
Beneath the surface of Lake Mead, 3 miles out from shore and 600 feet under the lakebed, there is a tunnel that most people who live off its water will never see and will never think about. It runs through solid rock in total darkness, connects to a concrete intake structure shaped like an oversized drain, and quietly keeps 2 million people alive in one of the driest cities on the planet. It took nearly 7 years to build, claimed a worker's life during construction, cost more than $800 million, and was gambled on before anyone could be completely sure it would work. This is the story of why Las Vegas had to take that gamble, what happened underground while it was being built, and why even now, with the tunnel finished and flowing, the city still isn't out of danger. To understand why anyone would spend a fortune drilling beneath an already enormous lake, you have to go back almost a century, to a document that quietly set the entire American Southwest up for a crisis nobody in the room at the time could have predicted. In 1922, 7 states sat down and split up the water of the Colorado River under an agreement known as the Colorado River Compact. The engineers and negotiators who drew up those numbers were working from stream flow measurements taken during an unusually wet run of years. Nobody involved understood, at the time, that they were measuring the river during one of the most generous stretches in its entire recorded history. Modern tree ring studies of the Colorado River Basin, going back roughly 1,000 years, show that the flows used to write the compact were on the high end of anything the river has produced in that entire span. In other words, the West built its legal water system on a number the river has struggled to hit consistently ever since. Every allocation, every farm, every fast-growing desert city downstream of that agreement has effectively been living against a river that was oversold from day one. Las Vegas did not create that problem, but geography put it at the front of the line to feel it. The city draws roughly 90% of its water from a single source, Lake Mead, the reservoir formed behind Hoover Dam when the Colorado was first impounded in the 1930s. For decades that arrangement worked fine, because the lake stayed close to full and the 2 water intake pipes built to draw from it sat comfortably below the surface with plenty of room to spare. The first of those intakes went into service in 1971, built at an elevation of around 1,050 feet, at a time when the reservoir was so full that anyone suggesting the water might someday drop below that pipe would have sounded paranoid. Population in the valley kept climbing through the following decades, and by the late 1990s the Southern Nevada Water Authority had finished a second, slightly lower intake, positioned to give the system a backup if the lake ever dropped further than anyone expected. Both pipes were reasonable, forward-looking pieces of infrastructure for the climate everyone assumed they were living in. Neither one was built for what actually started happening to the Colorado River Basin beginning around the year 2000. What followed was one of the most severe and sustained droughts in the region's modern record. Year after year, less snow fell in the Rocky Mountains, less water made it down through Lake Powell and into Lake Mead, and the reservoir's surface elevation kept sliding. Water managers watched the gap between the lake's shrinking level and the depth of the 2 existing intake pipes narrow every single year. It stopped being an abstract long-range planning concern and became an active, ticking countdown. If the lake kept falling at anything close to the rate it had been falling, the first intake pipe was going to be left high and dry, sitting uselessly above a lake that had simply drained past it. And behind that number sat an even harder ceiling, the elevation at which Hoover Dam itself can no longer pass water downstream at all, a threshold engineers call dead pool. Below that line, no infrastructure, no matter how cleverly built, moves a single gallon past the dam to anyone. Faced with that math, the Southern Nevada Water Authority made a decision in 2008 that sounded almost reckless when you said it out loud: build a third intake, and build it lower than any municipal water intake ever constructed in the United States, deep enough beneath the reservoir that no realistic drought could ever strand it. Not merely lower than the first 2 pipes, but positioned near an elevation of 860 feet, well below both existing intakes and just above the dam's absolute dead pool threshold. To reach water at that depth, the plan called for boring a tunnel roughly 3 miles long through the bedrock underneath the lake itself, connecting to a new intake structure sunk into what had once been a canyon of the Colorado River before Hoover Dam ever existed, now buried under hundreds of feet of water and lakebed sediment. The geology waiting for the crews underground was brutal. The tunnel route ran through the Muddy Creek Formation, a mix of hard volcanic rock and looser conglomerate layers cut through by fault zones. Those faults were the real danger. Many of them were partially filled with water that connected directly back to the lake above, meaning that at the reservoir's highest levels, A breach in the wrong spot could expose the tunnel to pressures approaching 17 atmospheres. That is not a small technical footnote. It means that for years, crews working hundreds of feet underground were drilling through rock that, in places, was one crack away from turning into a high-pressure fire hose connected directly to one of the largest reservoirs in North America. There was no plan B built into the design if a major fault opened up faster than crews could seal it. You drilled, you grouted, you reinforced, and you trusted the engineering. That risk was not theoretical, and it was not free of cost in the most serious sense of the word. On June 11, 2012, a worker named Thomas Albert Turner, 44 years old, was killed in a construction accident inside the tunnel. It remains the most serious incident of the entire project and a blunt reminder that the controlled emergency atmosphere underground was not a dramatic exaggeration for a documentary voiceover. It was the actual daily reality for the people doing the work. Crews operated in a 3-mile-long confined space, in high heat generated by machinery grinding through rock at depth, fully aware that hundreds of feet above their heads sat an active reservoir holding trillions of gallons of water, and fully aware that if something failed badly enough down there, there was no fast way out. The engineering challenge of simply staying on course compounded the danger. A tunnel boring machine advancing 3 miles through shifting, faulted rock has to hold an extraordinarily precise line to hit a target shaft waiting at the far end. Even a small deviation, spread out over that distance, can mean missing the target entirely, which would have meant abandoning enormous stretches of finished tunnel and starting over from a different angle at a staggering additional cost. Every meter drilled was, in a very real sense, a decision that could not be undone. There was no backing the machine up and trying again from scratch without eating months of schedule and tens of millions of dollars. Despite all of that, the crews kept moving. Tunnel boring machine work continued from 2011 through the end of 2014, grinding forward a few feet at a time through the muddy creek formations alternating hard rock and softer conglomerate, reinforcing the bore with thousands of precast concrete segments as it advanced. In December 2014, after nearly 7 years of design, mobilization, and drilling, the machine finally connected with the target shaft. Southern Nevada Water Authority officials confirmed it had hit its mark almost exactly where engineers intended, a moment described at the time as the culmination of one of the most technically demanding tunneling projects ever attempted in the country. The following year, in 2015, crews finished flooding the tunnel, equalized the pressure between the reservoir and the newly built structure, removed a massive steel plug that had been holding back the lake, and opened the connector tunnel that fed the pumping stations. Water began flowing to Las Vegas through the new intake shortly after. By the time all the invoices were settled, the total cost of the project came in at roughly $817 million, delivered by a joint venture of an Italian engineering firm and an American contractor working under a design-build contract originally awarded at just under $450 million. Every dollar of that overrun and every dollar of the original contract was ultimately paid for by the ratepayers of Southern Nevada, through water bills that climbed steadily through the years the tunnel was under construction. It is worth being honest about what that meant for ordinary residents. Households in the Las Vegas Valley were not paying more because they were using more water. They were paying more because the region's entire long-term survival depended on getting a hole drilled successfully through nearly 3 miles of unpredictable rock, and somebody had to fund it. Not everyone thought that money was well spent, and the criticism at the time was sharp and public. Some argued that pouring the better part of $1 billion into chasing a shrinking lake even deeper into the ground was throwing money at a symptom instead of the underlying disease, when that same investment could have gone toward large-scale water recycling, desalination research, or far more aggressive conservation mandates. Environmental advocates raised a different worry, that building an ever-deeper intake sent the wrong signal entirely, implying to developers and residents alike that the desert's growth could keep accelerating indefinitely because engineering would always find a way to bail the system out at the last moment. Water officials in Southern Nevada pushed back on that framing directly, arguing the project was never conceived as a growth strategy. It was insurance against a future that was already visibly arriving, a hedge built by people whose job is to plan for the worst realistic outcome, not the most convenient one. And the worst realistic outcome did, in fact, keep showing up ahead of schedule. In 2021, federal water managers made a declaration that had never happened before in the history of the Colorado River system. An official shortage designation, triggering mandatory water allocation cuts across multiple states simultaneously. The following year, the crisis became visible to anyone who looked at Lake Mead. By mid-2022, the reservoir had fallen to roughly a quarter of its total capacity, its lowest level since it was first filled in the 1930s. A lake that at full pool once stretched across nearly 250 square miles was visibly hollowing out. Boat ramps that had been built to reach the water's edge sat stranded, their concrete descending into cracked, bone-dry lakebed with no water anywhere near the bottom. A pale mineral ring, left behind on the canyon walls as the water retreated, climbed higher and higher, a literal geological record of every foot the reservoir had lost. And then the lake began giving back what it had swallowed decades earlier. The town of St. Thomas, a small farming and resort community submerged in 1938 when Hoover Dam's reservoir first filled behind it, re-emerged from beneath the shrinking waterline. Cracked pavement, building foundations, and the outline of what had once been a functioning small town resurfaced for the first time in more than 8 decades, drawing National Park Service researchers who moved to document the site before conditions changed again. Alongside the ghost town, the receding water also exposed something far darker: human remains, some connected to organized crime era cases from Las Vegas's past, resurfaced along the newly exposed shoreline in the spring and summer of 2022, prompting investigators to reopen cold cases that had sat frozen for decades. It was, all at once, a strange and unsettling public demonstration of exactly what running out looks like in physical terms, long before a water system actually fails. History and secrets a lake had hidden for generations, forced back into daylight because the water that concealed them was simply no longer there. Then, almost as abruptly as the crisis had accelerated, nature offered a partial reprieve. The winter of 2022 into 2023 delivered an exceptional snowpack across the upper Colorado River Basin and the Rocky Mountains, well above seasonal averages. As that snow melted through the spring, it fed rivers flowing down into Lake Powell and, eventually, Lake Mead. Mead's surface rose by more than 20 feet over the following year, while Powell upstream climbed by an even larger margin. Federal water managers revised their short-term outlook, and for a moment the mood around the reservoir shifted from crisis to cautious relief. Hydrologists were quick to add an important caveat, though: a single exceptional snow year does not undo 2 decades of sustained overdraft. Even after the rebound, Lake Mead remained well over 100 feet below full capacity, and scientists studying long-range climate trends in the Southwest have been clear that years like 2023 are likely to become rarer, not more common, as the region continues to warm. Drilling deeper was only one half of the response. The other half, quieter and arguably more consequential, was using less. No intake, no matter how deep, can outrun consumption if a growing city keeps drawing water at the same pace indefinitely. On this front, Southern Nevada's record is genuinely striking, and it runs counter to the popular image of Las Vegas as an extravagant, water-wasting desert playground. Since the early 2000s, the region has cut its water use per person by roughly 40%, even while adding hundreds of thousands of new residents. The valley today uses meaningfully less total water than it did 2 decades ago, a combination almost no other fast-growing American metro area can claim. Much of that comes down to deliberate policy rather than luck. Nearly all indoor water used in the valley is treated and returned to Lake Mead, earning the region credit against its overall Colorado River allocation, in effect, letting much of the indoor water supply get used more than once. Nevada also passed legislation restricting purely decorative turf, the ornamental grass lining street medians, office parks, and non-functional landscaping that served no purpose beyond appearance, removing it in favor of desert landscaping and saving a substantial amount of water annually in the process. Tiered water pricing and household consumption limits followed, making heavy outdoor water use progressively more expensive and giving conservation real financial teeth rather than relying purely on public awareness campaigns. None of that legislation passed without friction. Homeowners who had invested in decades-old lawns and landscaping were unhappy about new limits on something they had always treated as effectively unlimited. Developers and some local business interests warned that tighter water rules could slow growth in a region whose economy depends heavily on continued expansion. Southern Nevada's Water Authority pushed the policies through regardless, on the logic that the alternative, a valley that kept growing without limit until the water simply ran out, was a far worse outcome for everyone involved, including the people objecting loudest to the new rules. Put all of that together, the deepest municipal water intake ever built in the country, a comprehensive conservation program that is genuinely one of the most effective of its kind in the United States, and a fortunate run of heavy snowfall, and the honest answer is still that Las Vegas has not solved its water problem. It has bought itself time and margin, which is not nothing, but it is also not the same thing as permanent security. The tunnel reaches water at roughly 860 feet of elevation, well below where the first 2 intakes stop functioning, but it cannot reach water that isn't there. Below an elevation of around 895 feet, Hoover Dam hits dead pool, the point at which no water can physically pass downstream to anyone at all, no matter how deep any future infrastructure is drilled. Paleoclimate research on the Colorado River Basin shows multi-decade mega-droughts have occurred repeatedly over the last 1,000 years, conditions severe enough that, if repeated today, could plausibly push the system toward that limit. The 1922 compact that still governs how the river's water gets divided among 7 states was negotiated during one of the wettest periods in that entire long record, meaning the legal framework the modern Southwest depends on has effectively been running on borrowed climate for 100 years. There is a quieter risk sitting underneath the visible one, too. As lake levels rise and fall dramatically, sediment on the reservoir floor gets disturbed and stirred up, sediment that in some areas carries residue from decades of mining and industrial activity along the shoreline, material that had been considered stable while it stayed submerged and undisturbed. Rising and falling water levels can rework that old contamination in ways engineers are still studying. Building the deepest intake in the country secures physical access to water. It does not, by itself, guarantee everything about the water's long-term quality as the reservoir keeps fluctuating. All of this is why the renegotiation of the Colorado River Compact, expected to reach a resolution around 2026, matters just as much as any tunnel drilled beneath the lakebed. How the 7 basin states ultimately agree, or fail to agree, to divide a river that has never reliably delivered as much water as the original 1922 numbers promised will determine far more about the region's future than any single piece of infrastructure ever could. States with more senior water rights have historically resisted the deepest proposed cuts, while Nevada, forced by its position at the very end of the system to adapt earliest and fastest, has already reduced its per-person consumption more aggressively than any other state sharing the river. Whether that early adaptation gets reflected in how future shortages are allocated, or whether the underlying math simply overwhelms every state roughly equally regardless of how well each one prepared, is the real question the 2026 renegotiation has to answer. Right now, at this exact moment, 3 miles out under Lake Mead and hundreds of feet beneath the lakebed, the third intake sits exactly where engineers designed it to sit, in complete darkness, under enormous pressure, quietly pulling water toward 2 million people who will turn on a faucet today without a second thought about where that water actually comes from. Above it, the lake has partially recovered from its historic 2022 low but remains well below full. The mineral ring on the canyon walls is still visible, a permanent record of how close the system came to a genuine crisis. The ruins of St. Thomas wait beneath the surface for the next time drought pulls the water back far enough to expose them again. And the 7 states that depend on the Colorado River are still negotiating, right now, over how to divide a resource that was oversold on paper before any of their grandparents were born. Las Vegas took an enormous risk to build its way out of an immediate emergency, and by any reasonable measure, that gamble paid off. The tunnel works, it was completed without a catastrophic failure underground, and it has already proven its value by keeping the system functional through the worst drought conditions in the reservoir's recorded history. But an honest reading of the situation has to hold 2 things at once. The third intake genuinely bought southern Nevada real, meaningful survival margin, and at the same time, no tunnel, however deep, can solve a problem rooted in how much water actually falls on the Rocky Mountains each winter and how a century-old legal document divided a river that was never quite as generous as the paperwork claimed. The engineering held. Whether the climate and the politics hold along with it is the part of the story that is still being written, one negotiation and one snowpack season at a time.